everyone. My name is Candace Merrill. I'm with Western Washington University on the Peninsulas. Tonight's presentation is part of the Western Lecture Series. It's also part of a program by Humanities Washington that is able to send speakers all around the state. And so by their generous support, we're able to have with us this evening our speaker. So first I'd like to thanks for the support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Boeing Company, the Washington Secretary of State, and many private donors so that Mayumi can be here tonight. So I would like to introduce Mayumi Tsutakawa. She's an independent writer and curator who has focused on Asian Pacific American history. She co-edited The Forbidden Stitch, Asian American Women's Literary Anthology, which received the Before Columbus Foundation American Book Award. She edited 2 books on pioneer Asian American artists, They Painted from Their Hearts and Turning Shadow into Light. Mayumi received her master's degree in communications and her bachelor's degree in East Asian Studies at the University of Washington. And her graduate thesis is one of the few documents to research pre-war Japanese-American newspapers. Please welcome Mayumi Tsutakawa.
It's really great to be here. What a wonderful place Poulsbo is. We're sort of familiar with this area because our family has had property on Hood Canal forever, probably 50 years, I have to say. Anyway, I love this place. I love coming through here. Thanks for being here tonight. It's good to have an audience of all ages. And I want to say, Minasama konbanwa. And I know you all know what that means. It's good evening. Minasama konbanwa. The idea of thanking the National Endowment for the Humanities is really important. If you ever get a chance to talk with your elected officials, tell them that the National Endowment for the Humanities is really a good agency to support. Even if you think your elected officials already support the NEH, federal government funding for arts and humanities is in real danger of going down. So let's support the humanities. So I want to ask these questions. Why do I call this talk The Pine and the Cherry? So we have the pine and the cherry, which are very similar, very common to our state. So for us, the Japanese, we call the pine matsu, and it stands for longevity, virtue, youth, and power. And the cherry, sakura, stands for spring and renewal and the fleeting nature of life, because you know that when the cherry blossom blooms, it immediately falls, because that is the fleeting nature of the cherry. And I want to say that these are 2 sets of characteristics that I think are aims of every immigrant community: the strength and the fleeting nature of life. So the purpose of this talk, by the end, we're going to talk about these questions, is how does a vigorous immigrant community face racist or religious opposition? And what is our responsibility for building a just nation for all? So the other backstory that I'm going to talk about, besides 100 years of Japanese Americans in our state, is the story of my family's 100 years in this state. So as you know, there are many immigrant groups that started coming in the late 1800s. On the, it's a little bit, I don't know, a little bit blurry, sorry. But on the left is my father's company. His father founded an import-export company in Seattle. And if you know Seattle, that is located right about on the corner of 6th and Dearborn, right by CenturyLink Field, for all of you football fans. And the picture on the right is, my mom is standing on the left-hand side, and it's a picture of her and her family. Both of them were born in the United States, so both of them were American citizens, but they happened to go back to Japan as children separately, because my dad's a lot older than my mom, but separately, and lived in the area of Okayama and came back. So they went and came back. So to start off, here's the question. What is an immigrant? An immigrant is a person who comes to live permanently in a foreign country, not just coming to visit, to go to school, or to visit grandma or something like that, but who intends to live permanently in a foreign country. And for more than 100 years, Japanese newcomers to America arrived in the Pacific Northwest port cities and built lively communities. At first, contract workers were brought to work in lumber and railroads, and then fishing and agriculture. By 1906, the US government came to an agreement that the male workers could bring their spouses, even if it was by correspondence that they had gotten married. So of course you have heard of mail order brides. So this is what happened during that time. They were allowed to bring over their wives that they had only met by exchanging photographs, and sometimes those photographs were not as accurate as you would hope. Like getting off the boat and saying, "Where is the car?" That was in that photo. But this ended in 1920. It couldn't go on forever. By 1940, the census reported about 7,000 Japanese in Seattle. And many settled in the surrounding areas of King County, Pierce County, Kitsap County, as well as in eastern Washington in Yakima, Wapato, and Toppenish. There were as many as 1,000 Japanese farmers in the Yakima area before the war. So here's Japantown. Oops. Here's Japantown. Japantown in the International District of Seattle featured the familiar grocery stores, cafes, and services in their home language, as well as labor, music, and prefectural clubs. Prefectures were like states. They still have prefectures. They're states in Japan. And trading companies imported Japanese foods. The taste of home was found in stores selling confections, rice crackers, tofu, and Japanese restaurants served the familiar sukiyaki and miso soup. Excellent florists were supplied by Japanese greenhouses. Excellent strawberries came from Japanese farms in Bellevue, Redmond, Bainbridge, Kent Valley, where they cleared the land of first growth stumps even as tenant farmers, because they were not allowed to own the land. Early Japanese workers from outlying areas flocked to the Japanese bathhouses on weekends. They ate their familiar foods, and they stayed in Japanese-owned hotels. By 1900, there were 6 Japanese-owned hotels. But by 1925, there were 127 Japanese-owned or managed hotels, mainly in the downtown area. Even after the Depression decimated businesses all over Seattle, the Japanese entrepreneurs survived. By 1940, when Japanese were 2% of the population, they owned 63% of the produce greenhouses, 63% of the hotels and apartments, 15% of all restaurants, 23% of dry cleaning shops, and 17% of groceries. In fact, half of the produce stalls at the Pike Place Market were Japanese farmers. And many of these businesses were centered around the International District and were represented by the Japanese Chamber of Commerce. There was much economic competition in the city. And remember, real estate redlining meant that they could not buy or rent in any neighborhood they chose. Thus, they were kept to living in the Japantown the International District, and somewhat in the central area, which was up the hill more towards Yesler and Jackson Streets. So in this picture, of course, you see a very nice florist, which is supplied by the Japanese floral gardeners, and a really great little fish market right there on the street in the district. In terms of community culture, the Japanese were a very highly literate community. It means that they could read and write. It supported several Japanese language newspapers and the Japanese American Courier in English, the first Japanese American newspaper in English, edited by James Sakamoto. And he was a key player in forming the Japanese sports leagues for baseball and basketball. Sakamoto, did anybody here go to Franklin High School? Aha! So did I, my entire family. So Sakamoto went to Franklin High School, then he became a boxer, and he was injured in the ring, so he became blind. But because of his wife, of course, they were able to continue the newspaper business. And he put out this English language newspaper. So in the absence of very much social life geared for these foreign immigrant youths, these sports teams of baseball and basketball provided a good deal of excitement and identity affirmation. They had competitions with Japanese teams from other cities and even from Japan, organized by Sakamoto. In terms of the churches included Buddhist churches, but also Catholic and other Christian denominations, and they provided spiritual guidance and more chances for social solidarity. Often the Japan-born Issei, or the first generations, they preferred the Buddhist temples, like what they knew from their youth or their parents. And the American-born Niseis attended Christian churches in the community, in the Japanese community, as well as arts organizations and the Japanese school where they taught to continue to teach the Japanese language. The Japanese quickly enriched their cultural life. They had poetry societies, shigin, chanting, Japanese drama, and traditional dance like the kabuki, and music performances. The annual Bon Odori, the outdoor dance festival, which celebrates those who have departed, happens every year in August, as it still does today, in front of the Buddhist church. And it pays tribute to those who have passed away, just like we have the Day of the Dead also in the Latino community. So to tell you a little bit about my family, my father became an artist, and he was born in Seattle in 1910, the son of a Japanese import-export businessman. And he was taken to Japan when he was 7, and he came back when he was 17. So he went over there, didn't speak any Japanese. They thought he was really dumb, like, look at that kid, he can't talk. All he knows is English. He's an American pig. That's what the kids said. And then when he came back at the age of 17, he didn't know any English. And he had to go to an elementary school and sit next to small kids before he could remember. He eventually went to the University of Washington, but while he was growing up after the age of 17 and working, he lived behind a produce stand at the corner of Rainier and Jackson. So he took the streetcar. He says he took the streetcar to the University of Washington, or that's what he said. So he lived behind a fruit and vegetable market at that corner. And he became an artist. In his young years, a lot of the young artists used linoleum block print instead of wood block print. They used linoleum, and they had carving tools. And in fact, he went to Alaska in the summer times, like a lot of people in the community went to Alaska to earn some money with the fish runs in the fish canneries. And he saw this really magnificent scenery, and he wanted to record that, and he used block prints. And we have other ones that show fishes and, the cannery and so on. But he also loved painting, and he went up to the Cascade Mountains and the Puget Sound areas, and it reminded him of his childhood in Japan. because he grew up in Okayama, which is next to the inland sea. Very much like Puget Sound. The inland sea has the salt water, the fishing, the small islands, the little ferries, and so on. My mother was born in Hollywood. She loved to say she was born in Hollywood, but she never lived there after the age of 1 because she was sent to Japan to be raised by others, her aunts, while her mother was a busy entrepreneur running a restaurant in Hollywood, a Japanese restaurant in Hollywood. So this would be the 1920s and 30s. So my mom came back. She was there from the age of 1 to 14. So she came back and she joined her family in Sacramento. And once again, she didn't speak English. So she had to learn very quickly how to get along with other kids. And she even became Miss Japanese American Sacramento when she was in high school. But her high school years were not to be completed. So there were many forms of competition and hate legislation that led up to the internment of the Japanese Americans at the wartime. It wasn't just Pearl Harbor, bombs dropped there, that caused the incarceration of the Japanese Americans. The federal anti-immigration U.S. law said that aliens ineligible for citizenship could not enter. So after 1922, due to lobbying of competing economic groups and political groups, conservative political groups, immigration from Japan was cut off, and those who were born in Japan that lived in the United States could not become citizens. They were disallowed from even studying and taking the test to become a citizen. Because this phrase, aliens ineligible for citizenship, became accepted in the newspapers, in the press, in the political dialogue, that those Japanese are too different. Look at their language, it's so different. They don't write in English. Their religious ceremonies, they wear these gowns and they speak in this chanting. They are too different from Americans. So they are ineligible to be citizens. This phrase, aliens ineligible for citizenship. That was a federal law that was passed. And at the same time, the anti-alien land law was passed in several states, specifically referring to Japanese, so that non-citizens of Japanese ancestry in the state of Washington could not own land. They were disallowed from buying or owning land, or even entering into a lease of more than 3 years on one piece of property. So when you think about the farmers that had cleared the land, they could only lease for 3 years. And if the landowner wanted to take back the land that had been cleared, of course he could do that. Some purchased land or real estate in the names of their children because their children were born in the United States. So you had these little kids who were the landlords. But there were other Washington state laws that restricted the Japanese in different areas, such as fishing licenses were restricted, anti-miscegenation laws, meaning that they couldn't marry whomever they pleased. In other words, they were kept to their own race in terms of getting married. That's called anti-miscegenation. It outlaws interracial marriage. And there was a very active anti-Japanese league on the West Coast that was founded in Seattle by Miller Freeman, who is the grandfather of the current owner of Bellevue Square, Kemper Freeman. They supported, the anti-Japanese supported, the league supported all this legislation citing economic competition and the complaint that Japanese were breeding like rabbits. This is an allegation that was actually statistically not true, but these kinds of phrases and terms were passed along and even showed up in the media. So by the time that the wartime, World War II, came near, the actual attack at Pearl Harbor by a Japanese militarist government not the Japanese Americans in the United States, but the government of Japan, which they had left to come to the United States. It brought the expulsion of the Japanese on the West Coast. Those born in Japan, as well as their American-born offspring, all were rounded up and sent to concentration camps in the windswept, barren deserts, about 120,000 people, nearly half of them children under 18. Following on the heels of virulent pre-war anti-Japanese lobbying by conservative political groups, newspaper editorials, and political cartoons by famous newspaper artists such as even Dr. Seuss, they added to the anti-Japanese furor. And so immediately after Pearl Harbor, the heads of Japanese-born civic, religious, and business organizations were picked up by the FBI, and their houses were searched without search warrants. They were arrested without specific charges, no due process, and sent to jail camps in remote states, such as, I call them remote states, but Wyoming and Arizona. And their bewildered families were not notified where their family heads had been sent. They did not know. This is a phrase that kept coming along. They did not know. So this year is very significant, 2017, because 75 years ago, on February 19th, 1942, the order to evacuate, called Executive Order 9066, was announced by President Roosevelt and enforced for all those Japanese and Japanese Americans living within a 60-mile corridor of the West Coast, or whatever was so-called deemed militarily necessary. So they could identify other geographic areas besides this 60-mile corridor. For example, the entire state of California was named as militarily necessary, and other spots on the inland. A few brave politicians, such as the mayors of Tacoma and Wapato, stated their strong opposition to the internment. Bainbridge was the first community ordered to report to camp. A progressive journalist there, Walt Woodard, actively wrote against the internment. But they were the first because they were considered espionage, suspect to espionage, being that they were on an island in Puget Sound. They were first to leave of all of the Japanese Americans in the United States. And they were sent to an assembly center in Portland and then to Camp Manzanar, one of the 10 relocation camps, which is located in Eastern California. So now you see the change in the International District, all of those lively stores with the fish and the cherries and cherry blossoms and all that, completely closed up. The Pike Place Market was suddenly desolate, with over 50% of the stalls empty on the day that they were called to report. So now you see a family, a very nice family with tags, and each tag denoted the number, the code of that family, so that they could never change that. That was their code to report to camp. Each person, including these nice kids here, could only carry one suitcase. So when you think about it, they were not allowed to own houses, so they had to get rid of everything: books, toys, kitchen equipment, furniture, cars, tools. They had to get rid of everything or find a person that they thought was kind enough to store their items. For how long? They did not know how long. And there were many very good and loyal friends that did store the items. But as you'll see, these kids have one suitcase. They had to decide, would they bring their books, their art supplies, their dolls, their knitting, what clothing? They didn't even know where they were going in the whole United States. What clothing would they bring? Summer clothes, winter clothes, work clothes? So I do want to point out that during World War II, my dad actually served in the U.S. Army. He was an American citizen. He volunteered to serve in the U.S. Army, and he ended up serving in the MIS, the Military Intelligence School, in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Fort Snelling, where they taught, the Japanese American instructors taught the Japanese language in the intelligence, to the intelligence department that was dealing in the Pacific Front. So it is said that the Japanese American instructors helped to shorten the length of the war because they were able to speak the language, hear it, and break the codes. So while my father was serving in the United States Army, his future wife was in camp in Tule Lake, the northern edge of California. And she actually performed the Japanese dance there, which she had learned in Japan, because there were other people from other parts of the country who also studied the Japanese dance. She had some, compatriots there. So what about camp? The young people, remember 50% of them were American born. They wanted to play Glenn Miller and American music and American jazz. And their parents were the ones who wanted to listen to the Japanese music. So there was really, a separation there. In fact, there was also an economic, societal separation because some people, like in any community, some people had money and some people had none. Those people who had money actually could buy fresh produce and fresh fruit and cook it up on a stove that they ordered from Sears Roebuck in their barracks. But the people who had no money had to go to an awful mess hall where the kids ran around because they didn't have to sit with their families. There was very little familial control at that time. Some of the kids said they had a great time because they played baseball and ran around, and they didn't have to go to school very much either. Most of the Seattle Japanese spent the war years in Hunt, Idaho at Camp Minidoka, and they were sent there without due process guaranteed under our Constitution. The order to evacuate lasted from April to August around the West Coast. In April 1942, over several days, these 7,000 Seattle Japanese, the majority of them being American citizens, were sent first to bus to the ironically named Camp Harmony in Puyallup, which was their temporary camp. And then after a couple months, they were sent by train to Minidoka Camp in Idaho. Under pressure from the United States government, even Japanese Canadians, 12,000 of them, were interned in their own camps in British Columbia. And about 2,000 Japanese living in South America, in Peru on the West Coast, and Peru and other South American countries also were brought to the United States to be interned in these same camps, all because of the perceived perception of espionage, the possible act of espionage, which they thought, because of the virulent pre-war campaigning, that they thought the Japanese would commit. So Camp Harmony was hastily built at the state fairgrounds, and the internees there lived in horse stalls. Camp Minidoka in Idaho was built in the barren desert, and other Japanese from other parts, from the western part of the state, were evacuated, some to Tule Lake. So they didn't all go to the same camp. There was some military reason for that. The ones from Tacoma went to a different camp. The ones from Seattle went to a different camp. And the ones from Bainbridge also. So at the same time, there were many kind supporters from Seattle who extensively visited Minidoka to offer assistance, such as the Baptist minister, Reverend Emory Andrews. His name is well known in the Japanese community. And the Quaker leader, Floyd Schmo, and the Catholic priest who had served all of these Japanese community people in the central part of Seattle, Father Leo Tibisar. So Tule Lake, where my mother was incarcerated, in Northern California, became the biggest camp with 19,000 residents. And partly this is because in about the middle of the wartime, the U.S. government loyalty questionnaire to find out if there were some loyal American-born Japanese who would be willing to serve in the U.S. Army. So the loyalty questionnaire had about 20 or 22 questions, and 2 of them are very, very important. One of them was, do you forswear loyalty to the Emperor of Japan, and do you swear loyalty to the President of the United States? Some people said yes, and some people said no to both of those. Of the 78,000 adults, remember there were 120,000, 78,000 of them, of the adults, of that group, 12,000 said no and no. So they did not swear allegiance to the President of the United States. They became the famous no-no boys, and there are books about these people. They were ostracized amongst the Japanese Americans, and they became sequestered in Tule Lake, the one camp, the camp that became the biggest and the most highly secure. There were even riots, and unfortunately there was a murder because the feelings were so strong for and against. A number of the people who were in Tule Lake, in fact, left there, and others who had said no and no, and they were in the other camps, they were sent to Tule Lake. So that became the most high security camp, and that's where my mom and her family was living. So as you see, of course, they had some American activities, such as the baton twirling and so on. But I do want to talk a little bit about the culture in the camps. This Mrs. Shizue Iwatsuki was born in Japan, and she came from Hood River. So there was a big Japanese farming community in Hood River next to Portland. And so she was in camp at Tule Lake and then Minidoka. And she received honors from the Emperor of Japan for her fine haiku and tanka poetry. Let's read a little bit of these short poems. He was kind to us before, but now the shopkeeper nervously refuses to serve us. And then she said, fields in summer heat, people work till they falter, returning to camp only to be locked up. And the third one, a friend dies, people gather in silence. The sad sound of the cooler, there are more bodies inside. Why? Because they did not know how long they would be there. They didn't know if they should bury their loved ones in the makeshift cemeteries, which are still there now, at those 10 camp locations, or hold the body in the cooler to come back to their hometown of Seattle to be buried in their own plot. And this is why I say they did not know. At the same time, people like my mother were performing their Japanese cultural activities at the camp, and my mom was a very young teenager, and she has been quoted as saying that she had some good times in camp. She also met my father in an arranged marriage, but her parents seemed to have a little bit more funds, and they had some decent food that they cooked and so on. But this picture right here on the right, we only discovered this a couple of months ago. After 75 years, we only found this because on public television, some cool people in California had done the research on performing arts in the camps. And so I didn't see it. My brothers were sitting there, they were going, there's Mom. And so we found the piece online, and I copied the picture, and I put it in here because this is a very, actually a very high level of Japanese dance, because they had the finest teachers in this camp, because they were all kind of pro-Japan in this camp. So my father had gone to visit his sister, and my mom's stepfather and my father's sister arranged their marriage. They only met once. And then he left, and they didn't see each other again until 2 years after the war. But they did correspond, and he proposed to her by sending a ring through the mail. to her in camp. So I guess she must have said yes, because here I am today. So resettlement. The Japanese school still stands. This is the same place that they had studied Japanese language before the war, but after the war it became kind of another barracks, because a lot of the people did not have a place to stay when they came back. Remember, they didn't own a house. So at the same time, I do want to point out that at least 4,000 of the Japanese American soldiers joined the U.S. Army in the highly decorated and segregated unit of the 442nd and 100th battalions, the 442 and the 100th. Segregated means they were all Japanese. There were no other races of people in that unit. This also happened with African Americans. There were segregated units. And the 442 and the 100 suffered the highest percentage of casualties of any unit in the U.S. Army in the European battle zones. At the same time, there were a few brave Japanese Americans who sat in jail for resisting the evacuation order. Gordon Hirabayashi, a University of Washington student, so he was only about 20, had one of the most celebrated legal cases and finally was vindicated by the Supreme Court in the 1980s. The highest court of our land found that there had been no military necessity for the internment because there had never been any proof that any Japanese committed spying for the Japanese government, any form of espionage. So that negated the whole purpose of the camps. So Gordon was this young 20-year-old student. He did not show up for the buses when everyone else, even his family members, were told that they must go to Camp Harmony. He stayed in his dorm room, and then after they all left, he got up and he reported to the King County Jail. And the staff there said, well, what are we going to do with you? I mean, here you are. So eventually he was put in jail. And as he sat in the King County Jail, hundreds of UW students rallied on his behalf because he had stated that he believed in the Constitution of the United States. The camps closed by the fall of 1945 after the 2 bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing about 200,000 people instantly, including my mother's older brother. He had stayed in Japan when she came back, and every male person in Japan was recruited or drafted to the Japanese military. And he was in training in Hiroshima when the bomb was dropped. So that's one of the reasons, actually, that my mom put off getting married to my dad for a couple of years after the war, because she was mad at the U.S. Army. She was very sad for a long time. Well, first of all, it took a long time to get the news. So these internees returned to Seattle, Tacoma, and the Yakima Valley, where most of them had lost everything and could not find jobs. The 1,000 Japanese farmers from the Yakima, Toppenish, Wapato area, only 10% of them returned. Only 10%. Most of them decided, what the heck, I didn't own the land anyway, and now it's gone, what do you call it? Fallow? Yeah, it's gone fallow. How did they rebuild their lives? Many of the Japanese had no home to come back to, and they stayed in the Japanese school or those same Japanese churches for temporary shelter. Often their old neighborhoods and former places of employment were openly hostile to their return, with graffiti scrawled on their houses that said, "No Japs wanted." Many fewer Japanese farmers could return to their homesteads south of Seattle, and only 10% of the Japanese from Yakima returned. The others moved to California or Western Washington. And the employers, many of them refused to rehire the Japanese, fearing rebellion from their other workers or from their customers. Okay, what happened to my family? Here we are. That's me sitting on my dad's lap. I was really chubby. So my father did graduate from the University of Washington, and he received his Master's of Fine Arts. And so he found a teaching position at the University of Washington, first in the Japanese language department, because that's what he was doing during the wartime in the Army. But because he got his degree in art, he finally found a position teaching in the School of Art. So all of my three brothers and I, we grew up in that house is near 12th and Alder. My mom called it a chicken shack. I guess it was very modest. And then we moved to the Mount Baker community in Seattle, where we all went to Franklin High School. And my three brothers and I all have gone into the arts. My cousins, who had been at Tule Lake, what did they do after the war? My father's sister was married to the man who founded the Uwajimaya stores. So they worked really hard, a very large family, and they now have a group of large Japanese stores, import-export stores. So my dad was told by his friends, why don't you try sumi painting? Here you are, you're doing watercolor and oil painting. Why don't you try sumi painting? You're Japanese. So he did try it, and he found that in the latter part of his career, he was very adept at the painting of his beloved Northwest landscape in using the Japanese black charcoal ink called sumi ink. And he made sculptures, and eventually the sculptures such as this one, which is placed at Camp Harmony on the Puyallup Fairgrounds. It was just rededicated last month, September. And it is dedicated to the Japanese-American temporary residents. And you'll see a figure of a man, woman, and child, and dedicated to the Japanese-Americans who had to live there temporarily. And ironically, it was called Camp Harmony, but he calls his sculpture Harmony. Eventually, because my dad was a good sculptor, he was asked to design a fountain, and he had never worked with water before, but he was asked to design a fountain sculpture for the new Seattle Public Library, which was built in 1957, I think. It was designed by Naramore, Bain, Brady, and Johansson, who had been his students at the UW. It was good that he taught in the School of Architecture, and he met a lot of the architecture students. So when the new library was going to be designed by Rem Koolhaas, the internationally famous architect, Koolhaas wanted to get rid of this sculpture. And a lot of people protested, especially the funders. So it was replaced, and you'll see it in the front of the building on 4th Avenue rather than the 5th Avenue side. And we're very, very proud that the original Fountain of Wisdom that he designed that long ago is still up. And my dad came to design more than 75 fountains in the US, Japan, and Canada. And each one is a part of the landscape. It's a public fountain that other people can enjoy. He always felt proud that they could enjoy it rather than his artwork being in a gallery or a museum. George Tsutakawa. Yeah, he passed away in 1997. Okay, so he also wanted to dedicate this sculpture to his, in the International District, to the fact that his family had started out there, and that the International District is now a real cooperative community of many different Asian ethnic groups. So he felt very good about donating this sculpture to the International District. And he died at the age of 87 in 1997. So, as I said, all four of us kids have been involved in the arts. And in fact, my brother Jerry worked with my dad through all of those years, 50 years or so, to create and work on the sculptures. So he became a very good metal sculptor. And if any of you have been to Safeco Field, cherry sculpture is in the front. The mitt sculpture that looks like that with a hole in the middle of it. I like to say that that is the most photographed sculpture in all of Seattle because every kid that goes there wants to have their picture taken looking through the hole. So he has carried on the sculpture business in our family. My brother Deems has been a jazz musician for his entire life, since high school, since Franklin High School, and full-time jazz musician. And that other lady, I don't know who she is. My brother Marcus was the very recognized symphony orchestra conductor at Garfield High School, our rival high school. But he was there for many years, and in fact, my daughter went to Garfield High School. So his group, his symphony orchestra at Garfield became nationally known. So here's something. A number of the fountains my dad made are kind of getting old, and so they're being renovated. My brother Jerry is, in the business of renovating my dad's fountains. So this one was owned by the Safeco company, Safeco Insurance Company in the University District, and now it's been taken over by the University of Washington. So that's my kids and some of our cousins, nieces, nephews, and so on at the rededication of this Safeco fountain. That's my mom in the middle there. So I like to show this picture because we are very proud to receive an award from the Japanese Community and Cultural Center of Washington State for contributing to the arts in Washington. But also, this is my mom who's sitting in the middle there. This is the last time she went out, and right after that, she moved to the nursing home. And after 4 years, she just passed away last month. So she looks really good for a lady who's just about to be sent to the nursing home to live full time. She was always able to compose herself and to pose because she had performed on the stage. I'm like the opposite. I'm like, hiding from the camera all the time. So now let's get to our discussion. And I know we really only have a few minutes now. Remember those questions? Every community I go to around the state, and now I've been to about 30, large and small. Every community has its own discussion, its own way of thinking about these questions. How does an immigrant community live with or react to racist or religious hatred? What immigrant group do you know well? And what is our responsibility, all of us, for building a just nation for all? Okay, so those are the questions you're going to think about. But I have an extra credit question. How should communities be compensated for past injustices? You probably know that the Japanese Americans did receive compensation for having spent time in the camps. It took 43 years of lobbying and arguing and different proposals. We should do this, we should do that, they should get this much, they should get that much. Finally, a bill was passed and was signed by President Reagan in 1988 to award $20,000 to each person, no matter what age they were when they were in camp or how long they had been there, because there was no way to prorate that amount. It was too difficult. I forgot how many people got it. I don't know, 60,000 or so people were counted in the payments. But remember also that their assets had been frozen or confiscated before the war, separate from the fact that they stayed in the camps. So my father's company, because it was ultimately owned by a Japanese national, was completely confiscated. The company, the assets, and the products that were stored, and the building, everything was taken. So you see, there's a very wide range of points of view on the compensation. But this is what Congress did through a lot of lobbying, especially the Japanese Americans from Seattle and our own Congress people, including Mike Lowry, were very active in making this happen. So at the very end, I will just show you that I have some sources. There is a sheet on the table there that names other books and resources and lists and films and things like that. If any of you are interested, that was put together by the Seattle Public Library, and it will include all of these. So that is the end of my talk. Thank you very much for coming.